Hello, hola. My name is Ana Rambola Gonzalez. I am a regional director of practice at Advance College, where I also lead the Language Justice Institute. The Language Justice Institute at Advance College is focused on elevating the importance of multilingualism with multilingual learners nationally, championing fair, inclusive education, and building an early childhood workforce that centers on racial and linguistic equity for every child and family. Welcome to our Supporting Home Language series, where we dialogue with experts in the field who have done extensive research and have deep knowledge of how teachers and programs support multilingual learners in their classrooms. Let's highlight that multilingual learners speak 2, 3, 4, or more languages, including dialects, American Sign Language, and vernacular. I am honored today to hear from our distinguished guest, Nick Terrones. Nick is an Indigenous early childhood educator who has worked and played with children and their families for over 17 years. He has served as a toddler and family educator, and most recently as a director. He is interested in anti-bias and anti-racist practices in ECE and views his work through a land-based pedagogy that centers Indigenous ways of knowing. He is also interested in finding ways to bring more men of color into the world of early care and learning. Nick will share the importance of supporting Indigenous languages and cultural heritage with young children. Welcome, Nick.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So let's begin. So Nick, can you share your personal connection to Indigenous languages and how they have shaped your identity and cultural heritage?
Yeah, my personal connection to Indigenous languages, and in particular my own Indigenous language of my tribe, the Chumash of Southern California, has been one has been a story and a journey of reclamation and resurgence and revitalization, if you will. And it's only been recently that I'm really embarking on that journey of learning my ancestral tongue. And more recently, as the director at the preschool that I was at, Daybreak Star Preschool, an Indigenous-based early learning center, we we really emphasize the idea of teaching through language, and providing these rich cultural experiences, Indigenous experiences, that were centered around the Duwamish tribe that's here in Seattle, Washington. And so we would undertake the responsibility to teach through Lashutseed or Twelashutseed, and teach children some of these some phrases, as well as identifying our plant and animal relatives that we live with here in Seattle. And so, my personal connection has been one that I think is just scratching the surface, that is really taking this decolonized mindset, but more specifically, re-indigenizing, right? I think often when we hear this term decolonizing, if we decolonize something, what are we left with, right? We're kind of left with a void. And so I like to emphasize the phrase of like, let's re-indigenize, because re-indigenize puts more of the focus on the indigeneity of people rather than on the colonizer sort of aspect of it. So, I think, yeah, in some, my personal connection has been one, like I mentioned, that is just scratching the surface, one that is hungry and really seeking out uh, a lot of knowledge. And it's that being, in early learning, being committed to lifelong learning that is keeping me um, motivated and not like defeated, because at least for my ancestral language, there's not a whole lot of resources out there. And I've been trying to tap into the Wishtoyo Foundation that is based in Malibu, California, um, ancestral lands of the Chumash that trying to get access to some language classes, but it's been a little hard. Um, but I'm that hunger keeps me searching for it.
Thank you, Nick. And that is why we are here, to continue to advocate for our native home language. And I appreciate that you shared that while you were a teacher and director, you really emphasized and taught these young children some phrases. And that is, we know from what research shows that children have the capacity to learn multiple languages. And so thank you for sharing that. And so as we continue this conversation, could you tell us about any initiatives or efforts you've been involved in or witnessed to revitalize or preserve these languages and traditions in your community or in your personal life?
Yeah, I think I'll start like at the bigger picture through a lot of colleagues. It's really came there's a healthy amount of Native American efforts that are have really drawn inspiration from the Maori practices of language nests in their classrooms. And so really having a full immersive experience of everyday learning and classroom experience that is rooted in the language of the indigenous peoples of that area. And one of those really big revitalization projects has come out of the over in the lands of the Ojibwe, which is sort of like your north midwestern area of the United States, and they've really reconnecting themselves back to the land. And that's a big important component, and that's what has really drawn me to land-based pedagogies, is that for Native Americans and most all of Indigenous people, even Irish Indigenous people, a lot of our languages are deeply rooted in land. And if you take land away from the Indigenous people, as which was done for Native Americans here and a lot of other Indigenous people who have gone through colonization, then you're really stripping away the language, right? And if you strip away the land and the language, then you're stripping away their identity. And when that happens, then it's this colonized effort to homogenize groups of people to be one particular mold. And for us here in the United States, that's to be this, American citizen. That's really defined in this Eurocentric sort of view. And so when we have these language nests and we have these efforts that are going back to the land to teach through language, then we're really starting to disrupt that narrative of what, your typical perspective of what being a citizen might be. And it really challenges the idea of what is citizenship, in the United States here. And so that's kind of like at the bigger picture, and like kind of down into narrowing it down to my personal experience recently at Daybreak Star. We I really pushed our school to do more land-based activities that again emphasized the first language, the first people, the first names of our plant and animal relatives. And like I had mentioned earlier, that meant for the children to learn toilet chute seed. But before the children learned it, we, as the adults had to learn it. And so we brought in a language knowledge carrier uh, from down south of Seattle, and from the Puyallup Language School. And Puyallup is one of the Coast Salish tribes here in Washington. And we spent about like a 7-hour crash course in toilet chute seed, and like learning the sounds of the alphabet that they have. And one of the things that was emphasized, and this is true for even my ancestral language, of the Chumash that, and from what I've heard of a lot of Native people, that the words and the pronunciation of languages is it's associated to what you would hear in nature, right? And so there are some words in Twilit shoot seed that really that like are that either emulate the wind or the water. So right now, as I'm pronouncing Twilit shoot seed, that's kind of a more Americanized way of pronouncing it, but it's more like like, so it's like, really there's this idea of air and water, right, that come together in this word that to identify the language. And so when if we're going to teach these words, then we have to make sure that we're bringing in a land component with it, right? Because this is all relevancy, is what makes it like more impactful for the child's learning. And so we would often, follow the seasons, right? With what we were, and associate that to our curriculum. And so during early spring to early summer, we would talk about stinging nettle, or studs in the Twilit shoot seed. And studs teaches us, we would attach a social emotional component. It's stinging nettle, and if you get stung by it, it kind of it irritates your skin a little bit. And so studs teaches us to move with intention, right? To be aware of where you're at on the land, and to be mindful about how you move through spaces amongst other relatives. But also studs teaches us about partnership, because always next to studs is sahulch, or sword fern, and sword fern is a remedy for the irritation on your skin that you get from studs. And so we would say, hey, if you run into studs because you're not paying attention of where you're at, then look for sahulch. And sahulch, look to the underside of sahulch, scrape off some of the brown spores, rub it in your hand, put it on the irritated spot, and and kind of, and just be mindful about where you're at. And studs also teaches us about resourcefulness. I believe every part of studs, stinging nettle, is edible. So we would teach the kids how to harvest it, and with like where and how to harvest it without getting stung, right? And again, like being very intentional about your approach to something, and then what to do after you harvest it. So often we would model to the children. You harvest it, you say thank you to studs, and you say thank you to the earth for providing studs for what we're about to use for it. And the idea of, like, if you're taking something out of the earth, then you also have to give something back. And so we would sprinkle like traditional tobacco that's gifted to us from community members, and then we would share a story about studs and how studs um, helped the native tribes find inner strength as well. Because, like, if you get stung, then you kind of have to, like, live with it if you can't find uh the sahulch to remedy it. And come to find out also, and this is like where I think Indigenous and Western education come together. What Western science has told us with the sting of studs is that it's good for your blood. It's good for the lymphatic system. And so there's stories of strong warriors who would like flog themselves with it, in specific areas, like where your lymph nodes are at, under the arms, right, to stimulate your immune system, on the neck, and it brings you strength. So you have all these very, like, as I'm talking about it, there's obviously all this intention, and there's all this learning. There's STEM components of, like, what we associate to uh to Western academic school readiness components. And then there's also this traditional knowledge that's being passed on. And these are where these two worlds can come together and complement one another, right? And 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 so it was always like very fascinating to have certain plants serve as our teachers. And as the adults, we're not necessarily these expert carriers, but we're just sharing what we have learned through our language teacher that we had, through our own research and our own experiences, through collaboration of one another. And Indigenous thinking and ways of knowing and ways of being tell us that if you have knowledge, it's your responsibility to share it, right? This is a reciprocity component, and this is how everybody is better for it. And there's as much individualism that is involved with the collective idea when we're thinking about Indigenous communities, because the overall collective community can only be as healthy and as strong as each individual, and as they take care of themselves, right? And as they gain their own knowledge and they contribute it back to the greater being of it. And I think the difference between Indigenous education and schooling and Western education and schooling is that there is that sense of responsibility of sharing knowledge, right? And doing so um, without expectation of compensation.
Thank you, Nick, for sharing that information with us. And, you know, culture is part of language, and they're not to be seen as different entities. And so thank you for providing us with that deep background information on the amazing work that you have done and continue to do. So thinking about your personal experiences, how have those influenced your perspective on cultural diversity, intergenerational relationships, and the broader cultural landscape of your community or the Indigenous community that you are part of?
Yeah. It's interesting because so the preschool that I was at is just one program under the bigger organization, which is called United Indians of All Tribes Foundation. And as the name implies, it's United Indians, and it's a nonprofit. So we're not attached to one federally recognized tribe, but we com- are comprised of many different tribal nations, right? You got myself, who's Chumash. There's Blackfeet and Blackfoot, indigenous folk. There are Alaskan natives. There's obviously a plethora of Washington State native, Tulalip, Puyallup, Nisqually, Suquamish, Snohomish. And so we all come together with this common goal to serve urban natives in the Seattle metro area, because Seattle was a relocation city, and meaning I forget what year it was, but it wasn't that long ago in history where Native folk in different parts of the country were were told by the federal government, like, hey, if you move over to Seattle, we promise you'll get education, healthcare, access to employment, all these promises that were never really uh, made true. And so United Indians was formed to make those promises fulfilled. And what I've learned about the cultural diversity of it is diversity only makes us stronger, right? Because we all have all these different ways of knowing and ways of being. Um, and while they're all diverse and different, there's more commonality underneath of it, at the root of everything. And again, a lot of it being land based and how we live in reciprocity with the land. And there's a huge component of interconnectedness, right? Through generations, through different ages, through our languages. One thing I like to think about, especially, and just thinking about my own tribal affiliation with the Chumash, even though they were a pretty large tribe in the Los Angeles Basin area. They all had different dialects and different languages, and so but they still communicated with each other, and there was like a base sort of root of words that were, that linked all the dialects. But then, as we also know, is that California is one of the rich areas of where there were lots of tribes, so many tribes. And just around the Chumash, there's at least like 30 other different languages. Now, what we know now, with Western brain science, is that someone who learns multiple languages deepens those neuro connections and whatnot. And so you got to really consider, what was the genius like for indigenous people being multilingual, right, in the United States. And I'm only thinking about my own particular tribe, and and there are stories that go to show that the Shumash, we were pretty savvy with like business and trade and commerce. So much so that we developed a currency made out of a specific shell only found off the coast on the islands of California. And they found these shells as far east as Oklahoma, in archaeological diggings. So there has been some sort of trade going on, right? We also know that there was the corn that was developed in what we now know as Latin America, found in the northeast of the United States. When we think about the tragic story of Thanksgiving and corn being shared, that corn came from Latin America. So there were these extensive trade networks, and you have to really consider the genius of indigenous people in the United States of being so multilingual, being able to navigate these cultural differences that, again, only made them stronger, that fed multiple nations, tribal nations. And so, I think when I think about your question more specifically, I'm thinking of it as the 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 genius that has been erased, or at least attempted to be erased. And I'm thinking about how that has influenced my perspective of, like, when we think about indigenous resurgence and revitalization, it's a forward, future looking sort of component. But in order to do that, we have to really acknowledge the past, right? The history. Um, and I'm trying to have a play on words in my mind of like indigenous, indigenous, like there's that indigenous that we had, and that we still have, and that and I think this is where a lot of my influence has been on the perspective of cultural diversity and the broader cultural landscapes, that it and it's specifically within my like early learning community, or at Daybreak with all kinds of different tribes. It's really acknowledging the fact that there's an interconnectedness of genius and experience, that everybody has something valuable to bring to the table, that there isn't just my thought, it isn't just one other person's thought, but it's all of our thoughts that come together to create this really strong foundation for us to, actualize and to achieve our mission and vision.
Thank you so much, Nick, for that background information, and the importance of diversity, and really recognizing, Indigenous for their geniusness, as you shared. So thank you for that. And now, thinking about your experiences, right? Is there a specific experience or story that you would like to highlight or share with us on the importance of these languages in preserving traditional knowledge or maintaining a sense of a cultural heritage?
Yeah. A specific experience or story there, I think the experience of being at Daybreak Star Preschool is is where I would like to go with this. Uh, and even though we're an Indigenous based school, um, we we welcome all different ethnic and cultural backgrounds to be a part of the community, and that's something that I find very interesting, is that we want to be able to serve and revitalize and affirm our Indigenous children and families who come to school there, but we also want our non-Indigenous friends and families to learn and experience this, right? And to give young children and young white children the experience of like, hey, this was somebody else's land first, right? And this is the first language. This is the first name of this plant relative. This is here's how we would sing a welcome song. Here's this first language. And it was always so amazing to to we would then we had a bunch of like handmade drums, and we would teach kids how to drum. Well, first, like, go through the protocol of a drum. How do you respect a drum? These only come out during certain times, and here's how we take care of it. And then here's some songs, and here's some stories that we can tell. And when teaching children the uh, Lashutsi words, they just took to it, and their eyes would light up. And especially letting them know, like, hey, this is the first language of this land, right? Like, and and he and there's so many interesting sounds in it that the kids would just love, because they get to like um get to make noises with their throat that you can't otherwise with English. And so it was a very fun experience for them. And I think to a certain degree, like, maybe for them, and not to downplay the child's experience, but maybe it was just sort of novel at first. But then as throughout the year, as we kept doing it, you can tell that they started owning it a little bit more. And it was great to see, like, that all the children, right, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, were really just owning the language. And it was very encouraging and uplifting to hear. So where Daybreak is at, it's like in an urban forest, and we there would often be a lot of the classrooms go for hikes, and by mid-spring, the children knew like the trails like the back of their hand, and so they would often request like their for their families to take them back to Daybreak during the weekend so they can take them on hikes through the trails. And so it was encouraging and uplifting for the parents to come back and tell the teachers and tell myself, like, hey, my child took us to the fairy village, or took us to these particular landmarks, and they would just run off on the trail, and I would yell for them to come back, or they would come back and be like, hey, follow me, you're going to get lost. And there's like little 3 or 4 or 5 year old child leading them through the forest. And and they would um and they would point out the plant relatives that they knew, right? Oh, there's sucklabats, the alder tree. There's huckpiots, there's the cedar tree. Oh, there's the uds, stinging nettle. And then right next to it is the hulch. And so they were like regurgitating this and taking that ownership of their learning. And it goes, and to me, it really emphasized again this idea of place-based education. But the important thing to do about place-based education is to indigenize it, right? Because there's wherever you go in this nation, it's indigenous land, it's native land. And so, you can be in a place, but we have to indigenize the locality of the place. Like, who was there first, right? What are those stories? Who are those people? What is that language? And so it was, if we take that idea of place-based language, it was fascinating and, again, uplifting. I don't know a different word for it at the moment, but very uplifting to hear that these children were indigenizing their local place, and that we were able to do it with them in the classroom. And it was, any teacher who, especially in early learning, when you start seeing the sort of fruits of your labor come to blossom, you just kind of, you're like, this is why I'm here. This is why I'm this is why this work is important, and it just adds fuel to that fire and that passion that I believe that we all have as early childhood educators and any educators really, because we're obviously not in it for the money, but it it's very we're in it for that rich experience with humans, right? And young humans, and to see them really take ownership of that learning. And so I think for me, it was when having the children like wanting to bring their parents back and then just share what they've learned, or even like singing a song, right? Like their parents would be like, can are you learning a song in Twilishutsi? Because I want to know the words so I can like sing it with my kids, and that was always very very joyful to hear too.
Thank you, Nick. And we know that children love to help their teachers. And based on what you just shared with us, now the children are teaching their parents
Hmm.
these words and taking them back to these amazing learning experiences that you and the rest of the team have provided for them. And we know that those experiences are forever going to live with them. So thank you for sharing your knowledge and experience with us. It was an honor speaking with you. Muchísimas gracias y hasta la próxima.
Gracias.
Mhm.